As I put my car into park, a grimace formed upon my face. This would have been the 4th disappearance of the month. Stepping out of my car into the night, I trudged up the path leading to the house and began to prepare myself mentally for what I was about to hear. I've always hated missing persons cases. I think anyone would, but this one was different. When I finally reached the door, I took a deep breath and then broke the silence with a few quick raps to the door. I waited for maybe 15 seconds, but those seconds stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could hear rustling inside, then 2 pairs of frantic footsteps approaching. The door swung open and I was bombarded by the incoherent babbling of an older woman, who I could only assume to be the girl's mother. Hey, calm down, it will be okay. I'm just gonna need to get some information. I looked over to her father. He was a shorter man, heavy-set, and had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He seemed less concerned, or at the least, much more calm. I tried to look him in the eye, but I failed. Finally, I spoke. So, why don't you tell me what you can about your daughter? Age, what she looks like, where she was last seen, and so on. Well, she's 16, just got her license, has long blonde hair. Most of this was information I'd already know, but I took out my notepad anyways and began writing down what he said. And when was the last time you saw her, sir? I asked. Well, last night she went out with her friends, to wherever to hang out. Told her to be home by 12, and she never came back. Called her phone, but she ain't never picked up. She's been gone for almost a whole day now, so I figured we should probably report it. And her name? Ann Walker. I took a moment to gather myself and prepared to depart. I wanted to be out of there. I didn't want to deal with another missing persons case. You have any other information that could potentially be helpful? I asked. Not really. I told you all I can remember. I sighed. Well, then I have to get going. If you know anything else, make sure to give us a call anytime. You've given us a lot of good information. I'm sure we'll find her in no time. That was a lie. I didn't know why I said it, but I did. As I turned to return to my car, I heard the door shut behind me, then heard the mother's hysterics start once more. I returned to my car and slumped into the driver's seat. I turned the keys in the ignition and was finally able to escape the silence of the night. When I returned to the station, I quickly went into my office, slammed down the notepad, and then suffered through the monotony of the night. I told myself that I would search the next day. When I finally got home, I collapsed into my bed, but found myself restless. Eventually, I was taken by sleep. When I woke up, my whole body was sore. My bones ached. My mind felt as though it was put through a blender. That night was restless, and I felt horrible. That didn't change the fact that I had to go to work and investigate. I didn't expect any leads. Maybe I was being pessimistic, but I didn't care. In my mind, I was being realistic. Despite my body crying out in disdain towards even the thought of doing anything productive today, I knew that it was my job to look into the case. Eventually, I mustered up the strength to leave my house and go to the office. When I got to the office, I quickly gathered my stuff and left. Despite my contempt for this case, along with the others this month, I made haste. I didn't get any leads at first, talking to friends, family members, and whatnot. But eventually, I got information. A friend of hers told me that she might have gone to an old abandoned high school. The high school in question was abandoned near the end of the 80s. The student body outgrew the building, and a new one was built. Now the old high school is sometimes used by teenagers to hang out and drink or get high. I'm sure this girl's parents wouldn't be fond of the fact that their daughter is out smoking and drinking. But a lead is a lead. I thanked the friend and walked back to my car. As I buckled my seatbelt, I noticed that the sun had started to set, and the chirp of the crickets had begun. I started my car and began to drive towards the old school. As I got closer to the school, the buildings became more and more broken down. They were more sparsely populated and less taken care of. The lawns were overgrown, windows were boarded up. The signs of now closed shops were faded and barely legible. Despite being only 30 or so years since the school closed, the area declined rapidly. The area was like a ghost town, but that's why kids loved it. They could get away with a lot. Eventually, I pulled into the cracked and weed-infested parking lot of the school. I parked my car and stepped out. The building was large and made of now cracked brick. It stood 2 stories tall and had large windows periodically placed upon the walls. I walked up the steps to the front door and pushed open the large metal door. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I knew it was a bad idea. I always preferred to work alone. As I entered the building, I let out a large but unsure hello. But I wasn't met with an answer. There was still enough natural light left for me to not need a flashlight when navigating the building. I was bombarded by a thick smell of must. Underneath, the tile floor was cracked from multiple years of exposure to the elements, and the sounds of my footsteps were exemplified by it. I remember going to this high school as a student. Seeing it this decrepit was sort of depressing. I turned into a classroom and looked around. There was litter all across the floor, and some desks were overturned. Most rooms I checked in the high school were like this. When I got to the cafeteria, it was more of the same. A thick, musty odor, cracked tile, and general uncleanliness. I walked towards the kitchen, but something peculiar caught my eye. The kitchen was clean. I didn't think much of it at first, but the longer I stood there, the heavier it weighed upon my mind. Alas, the sun was setting, and I knew I hadn't covered the whole school yet. And if I wanted to have a chance of finding anything, then I needed to work quickly. I left the cafeteria and began towards the stairs to the next floor. The stairs were wooden, and thus rot had consumed a large amount of them. As I walked up the stairs, I could hear creaks underneath my feet. There wasn't much of a difference upstairs. It was all the same, rotted and destroyed. As I was searching through one of my old classrooms, I heard the sounds of footsteps beneath me. "Hey, I know you're in here," I shouted, but I didn't get a response. "Your parents are looking for you. You need to come with me," I shouted once again. But again, I was met with no response. The footsteps were louder now, and more rapid. The sound of the steps more closely resembled a disoriented shuffle than a walk. "Don't run from me. Stop." I still had yet to identify the source of the footsteps, and for some reason, I was yet to pursue them either. I sprinted down the stairs, but came to a horrific realization. The steps were not running away from me. They were coming towards me. I looked down the hallway and saw the silhouette of a figure. But this figure was not human. or at least was no longer. It was hunched over, with huge shoulders and gnarled and disfigured arms. I couldn't make out most of it due to the now set sun, and for that I am thankful. I was paralyzed in fear as I stared down the hallway at the beast. In that moment, I knew what was causing the disappearances in town, and I knew what I had to do to stop the disappearances. The sudden movements of the beast shocked me into action as I reached out to my hip for my gun, but my gun wasn't there. I don't know what kind of idiot forgets their gun at the office, but evidently, I fall into that category. I didn't know what to do in that moment, so I ran. Somehow, I got out of the building and into my car. I fumbled with my keys, shoved them into the ignition, and slammed on the accelerator. I drove to the office and tried to collect myself, but I couldn't. I knew what I had to do. I just needed to do it. There was no option. I had to return to the school and shoot that thing that resides there. As I entered the office, a colleague asked me what I was doing, but I gave him an empty answer. For me to kill that thing, I couldn't tell anyone where I was going. They would just interfere and waste my time. I knew what I was doing, and no one could stop me. I grabbed my gun and walked out of the building, head down, and to my car. I swung open the door and put the key into the ignition. The night had fallen completely. I pulled out of the lot and began to drive towards the school. As I drove through the night, the buildings around the school took a more sinister look to them. Years of abandonment hadn't treated them well. Eventually, I arrived at the school once again. I gazed up at the large building that loomed overhead. I knew what was in there. Now it was my job to kill it. I walked up the steps and swung open the door. I felt the crunch of the tiles under me and readied my gun and flashlight. I walked down the hallway and swung open the various doors, but there was nothing. I checked the cafeteria and the mysteriously clean kitchen and noticed a strange door that was left hanging open, leading to darkness. But I didn't have time to investigate this door, so I turned back out of the kitchen and headed into the cafeteria. As I walked towards the doors exiting the cafeteria, I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the thing. It stood there menacingly. I raised my flashlight to get a better look at it, and noticed its face looked oddly human. I acted only instinctively and aimed my gun and began to fire. It tried to run towards me, but was stopped by the barrage of bullets. It slumped down and it died. I let out a deep sigh and looked at the now dead beast. It's over. But as I looked at the thing, I noticed something odd. It had a green tag on its ear, and one of those disposable wristbands around its arm. I bent down to see what it was, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. Experiment number 8, June 5th, 1989. This couldn't be right. What was this thing? Why was this thing? I didn't know, but if this was number 8, there could be any number more. I needed to investigate. I needed to know. I turned back towards the kitchen and began to walk. I walked for what felt like an eternity, despite it only being 10 or 15 steps. Once I was in the kitchen, I looked at the odd door that hung half open, and I knew that is where it came from. I opened the door and found a flight of metal stairs leading down to a dark room. Unlike the rest of the school, these stairs were not destroyed. In fact, they looked quite well maintained. I trudged down the stairs and into the dark room. I shone my light around the room. and suddenly, it all made sense. The room was lined with odd glass cages, and various tables and filing cabinets were filled up the middle. In some of the cages sat what I could only assume to be other experiments, but most were dead, or in the very least inactive. 30 years ago, there were a series of unexpected disappearances, all high school aged. 30 years ago, the school closed and a new one was opened. But then, why were the disappearances happening once again? I noticed something odd. There was no dust down here. It was clean. Too clean. I ran through the room and began to look at the cages with experiments in them. As I read the dates and the experiment numbers, the truth was finally revealed. Experiment number 20, May 23rd, 2021. I felt sick as I read the words. The experiments have begun once again. Baby, have you seen my other heel? I sat kneeling in front of my closet, sliding doors pushed to the side. I shoved various shoes this way and that, hoping to glimpse a hint of red in the chaos. One lonely scarlet pump sat at my side, lacking its mate. Frustration swelled my chest and left me groaning as I threw yet another sneaker out of the way. Babe! Huh? My husband Max poked his head through the door. He was already dressed. Had been for hours. I had to admit he looked good in his slick black slacks and dark blue button-up, freshly shaven, hair a little overgrown in a way that added more charm rather than appearing messy. Oh, and don't forget the polished leather loafers that fit snugly around his feet. I'd have appreciated the sight more if we weren't already 15 minutes late. My heels, the red pair. I lifted the lone shoe up as an example. I can't find the left one anywhere. I could hear my own voice take on a hysterical edge. This was the first work dinner I'd been invited to since I started at the company 2 years ago. My first chance to brush eyebrows with the bigwigs, show them I was worthy of the promotion I'd applied for a few months back. And here I was about to blow it, all because of a stupid shoe. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes as Max came up behind me, jumping into problem-solving mode the second he saw me crumbling. Hey now, it's alright, we'll find them. He knelt down next to me, rubbing the small of my back and glancing over me into the mess of the closet before us. I could feel him stiffen, my own sense of hopelessness washing over him as well. God bless him though. He kept a straight face. Is there any other pair you could wear? To put it plainly, my closet was a disaster. I knew it. He knew it. Hell, even the cat didn't venture in there anymore. Despite the fact I wore one of 3 pairs of sandals on a daily basis, I was a sucker for a good deal, and an even bigger sucker for a good shoe. They piled up in my closet like a precarious mountain. The eventual landslide, an even present threat. Of course, when I actually need a pair, they were nowhere to be found. It was my fault for not checking earlier. These last few weeks had been such a haze at work. I'd barely had time to purchase a new dress at all. The second I saw the silky scarlet number though, I'd known I had the perfect pair of shoes to match it at home already. I'd never even worn them. Maybe I never would. What about these? Max pulled out a strappy black sandal with gold embellishments running along the sides. It wasn't what I'd pictured, which made my throat dry. But for the sake of immediacy, I gave a solemn nod in agreement. He dug in to find the other. Soon his brows pinched together on his forehead. Shoot, I don't see this one either. Before I could melt down completely, he got me up off the floor and ushered me towards the living room. It took some convincing, but eventually, I slid my feet into the simple black flats that sat on the mat by our door. And we were on our way. A bunch of old suits wouldn't be staring at my feet, he assured me. I bit my lip to hold back any argument bubbling to the surface, and instead focused on coming up with an excuse for running late that didn't revolve around footwear. All went well. We weren't the only stragglers. In fact, fashionably late seemed to be the name of the game. We laughed, we joked, we stayed out far too late. It was an easier night than I thought it'd be, particularly with a glass or two of white wine warming my belly and bringing a delicate flush to my cheeks. I hadn't imagined I'd get along with my higher-ups so well. When they asked my opinion on an upcoming case, I knew I had it in the bag. By the time we made it home, I was stumbling through the door. Max helped me into the bedroom, the world blurring in a delightful, boozy haze. I collapsed onto our pillow-top mattress, my fancy red dress pulling up around my hips. By the morning, it'd be a wrinkled mess, but I didn't have the energy needed to fight that reality. He slipped the flats off my feet, and the last thing I heard before consciousness slipped away from me was a thump as he tossed them into the closet. I woke up the next morning, immediately regretting the fact I opened my eyes in the first place. Not only was the headache debilitating, my throat was so dry it felt like it was full of cotton. Jesus, when was the last time I had that much wine? I rubbed my mascara-stained eyes and spent the next 20 minutes trying to find the will to live. It wasn't until I peeked over at the nightstand and saw a few tablets of aspirin and a glass of water that I finally dared swing my feet to the floor. I could smell the coffee in the distance. I hope it hadn't sat out for too long. But at that point, beggars can't be choosers. I slipped the dress up over my head and staggered to the closet. It was only then that the memory of missing shoes came back to me. I sank to the ground and crossed my legs, digging back into the pile now that I had some time and space between my frustration. I paused as my attention caught a singular shoe sitting on the top, one of the flats I wore last night, sitting all by its lonesome. I started yanking each shoe out one by one, laying them in a circle around me as I went. Once I finally reached the beige carpet at the bottom, my suspicions had been confirmed. There were 20 shoes total, and not one of them had the left side of its pair. "Hey, sleepyhead," Max's voice called from down the hall. "Still alive in there?" His head poked through the door, and right away his brow raised. I must have been quite a sight, sitting there half naked, dismantling my closet. The thought hardly occurred to me though. Instead, my cheeks began to flush as a round of anger peeked over my half-drunken daze. "This isn't funny, Max," I snapped, pulling myself back up on my unsteady feet. "Where are they? What are you talking about? My shoes, Max. Where did you put my shoes?" He always complained when I came home with a new pair. It was one of the few things we actually argued about. Point made. But I couldn't believe he'd stooped to this level, just to make it. He rolled his eyes. I didn't do anything with your shoes, Piper. I only then realized that he was still dressed in his suit. No, a different suit, with a red shirt instead. He had a suitcase in his left hand. Where are you going? I asked. My trip, he explained slowly, like he was talking to a child rather than his already enraged wife. To San Antonio. That's today? I forgot entirely. I wasn't sure what was worse. My gut screaming at me that he had something to do with my missing shoes, or the fact we didn't have time to argue about it. Yeah, Piper, that's today. His annoyance was palpable, but still, he stepped forward to give me a kiss on the forehead. I've gotta go. I'll help you look for them when I get back, alright? Alright, I mumbled, sitting back on the floor. I heard his footsteps carrying him down the stairs, and the front door swinging shut behind him. An hour later, I'd pulled myself together as well as I could. I took a shower, had coffee, and forced down a couple pieces of burnt toast and peanut butter to settle my stomach. It wasn't until my phone lit up later that afternoon that my guilt over getting too drunk and picking a fight started to fade. It was a text from my boss. Apparently everyone loved me. This gave me the motivation I needed to slip into my workout clothes and grab my old pair of sneakers by the door. A run would surely get me feeling like myself again, sweating out the last remnants of poison pouring throughout my veins. I sat my shoes down on my dresser and tugged open the sock drawer. Just like that, the horrible gnawing feeling in my gut was back. Not misplaced anger this time, or twisting nausea. It was as if ice had seeped into my insides and frozen into sharp, uncomfortable spikes. I always sorted my socks when I did laundry, rolled them into matching pairs so they were easier to grab. But every sock in my drawer was loose. I shoved it closed, rushing down to my cell phone in the living room and shooting off a text to Max. This really isn't funny now. I'm freaking out. Please tell me. I won't even be mad. What did you do with all my socks and shoes? I paced along the worn carpet until I heard my phone buzz again. Your socks? Seriously? Honey, why would I do something with your socks? We'll talk when I'm home. I let go of a breath that I didn't know I'd been holding. A long, frustrated sigh. He was right. This was ridiculous. I couldn't imagine a single reason he'd hide my stuff. It wasn't something he'd ever done before. As annoyed as he was of my ever-growing collection, he'd never given me a reason to think he'd disrespect my belongings. I shouldn't have blamed him. But what other option could there be? I spent the rest of the day tearing the house apart. Cupboards, guest closets. Hell, I dug through the storage tubs we had stacked up in the basement. No sign of any of it. Not a single shoe or a missing sock in sight. As the sun began to dip below the sky, I turned my mind to plan B. We had a security system in the house since we bought it. But honestly, it wasn't something I put much mind to myself. Max was the one who handled any of the alerts, all of which were false alarms to this point. But I found our account information hidden away in his desk and gave them a call. One frustrating conversation later, I wasn't any further along than where I started. The alarm was in perfect working order, and nothing suspicious showed on its history. By the time that was over, I was equal parts hungry and exhausted. My whole day was gone to a strange mystery that I was no closer to solving. I grabbed a pack of crackers and crawled into bed, nibbling half-heartedly on them until my mind started to drift away. I'm not sure what time it was when my eyes fluttered open once more. All I knew was that it was dark. Only the briefest flicker of street lamps sending an eerie glow through our window. The house was quiet, except for the air conditioner humming softly in the background. I yawned and stretched my legs out towards the edge of the bed. And then I froze. Something was wrapped around my left ankle. There it was again, that frozen dread seeping out inside of me. It started in my gut and spilled out into my arms and legs, forcing them down with an invisible weight. I hadn't been sure what had woken me at first, but now it was clear. Something had grabbed me. It was still there. I didn't want to look. Everything inside of me screamed for me not to instead tuck myself under the covers until morning came. A leftover survival mechanism from my childhood that apparently never faded. If I ignored it, then maybe, just maybe, it would go away. Adult problems weren't that simple though. Besides, I'd passed out on top of the comforter. All there was me and whoever was holding on to me. Tears strung to my eyes. I breathed in deep, and then I looked down. An unintentional gasp left my lips, violent and fearful. I'd expected a man to be towering over my bed, bathed in shadows, gun in hand, but what I saw was so much worse. It wasn't towering at all, instead perched up on the foot of my bed, held up by its elbows as one hand wrapped around me. The light beam hit its arms perfectly, illuminating thick yellow claws nearly an inch long. Its skin was so pale, and it almost glowed, except for the spots of dirt that stained its arms and torso. Its face was the last thing that came into view, and that was when a scream started to rise in my throat. Its eyes were just as yellow and gnarled as its claws, sitting diagonally on its ashen face. It doesn't have a nose, instead its second eye was set in the groove where a nose should have been. Its mouth hung open, sharp canines in the front that became shorter and thicker further into its jaw. Its tongue flicked through the gap in its front teeth, landing wetly against the base of my foot. My scream tore loose. I kicked with my free leg, the blow connecting with the side of its head and leaving it faltering backward. Its hand tightened around me, a terrible noise springing from its maw. It was laughing, giggling at me. I pulled against it with all my might, kicking and screaming, and flailing wildly to get it off. It held tight. I was no match for the strength in that single appendage. Soon I was sliding forward, up off the foot of the bed and onto the bedroom floor. I hit with a yelp, pain shooting from my tailbone up into my neck. The impact stunned me for a moment, but by the time I came to again, we were heading towards the stairs. "No!" I screamed, twisting to grab the bathroom door frame as we passed it. Again, the creature giggled, darting up on top of me and straddling my waist. It moved like an ape, settling in on its haunches and using its arms to balance itself. It flashed a toothy grin my way and raised a hand high up in the air. The blow connected with my nose. A crack echoed off the walls and blood seeped into my open mouth. My arms went weak. It grabbed my ankle once more and tugged me onward. Soon I was sliding down the stairs, head bouncing against them like a rubber ball. A new sound tore from my lips, a weak, pitiful whine. I tried to grab a hold of the railing, but I couldn't make my fingers listen to my half-hearted commands. We hit the landing and took a left. It was leading me towards the kitchen. It dropped me once I'd crossed the threshold onto the ivory bright tile. It stood up on its hind legs, hopping over to the stove, as if it knew this place well, as if it had been there before. It reached up towards the knife block and grabbed a large, sharpened blade from the set. "No!" I cried again, shoving numbly against the ground. My head ached, worse than the hangover, worse than anything I'd ever felt before. Everything was distant, disconnected, yet somewhere in the deep fog that had settled within me, the reality of the situation was all too apparent. I was going to die. I'd barely made it up on my hands before the creature approached me again, tilting its head as it took in the sight of me. It was a hungry sort of look, similar to the one that some of the partners from my firm had given me the night before. I'd enjoyed it then, being wined and dined by them. There'd been a power in it, an advantage. I felt nothing of the sort now. The look was directed firmly at my foot. Its arm lifted and fell before I could mutter another languid protest, another scream. The blade dug into my ankle, cutting expertly through the skin and muscle, only stopped short as it met the bone. The world tilted, my vision turned red. It tugged the blade back, meeting resistance as it stayed wedged inside of me. It laughed again, the terrible noise rising in pitch as it shifted to pull again. It was almost worse when the blade was leaving. A gurgling noise seeped from my throat. Once the knife was free, it was tossed to the side. My ankle was lifted delicately, lovingly to its lips. Its tongue darted out again, dipping it into the crimson blood that was leaked from the wound. Bile stung my esophagus. I twisted hopelessly against its grip. The last thing I remembered is its jaws clamping down on the bone. Then everything went black. I woke up in the hospital a day later, bandages wrapped tightly around the stump of my leg, and Max hunched over in the chair next to me, tears streaking his face, still wearing the now wrinkled red shirt that he left in. He embraced me, begged me for details. I wasn't sure what to say. The neighbors had heard me screaming and called the police. By the time they'd made it there and busted down the door, the creature was nowhere to be found. I was a bloody mess on the floor, barely clinging to life. A trail of blood led down the basement stairs to a patch of loose dirt and cement at the end of a supply closet. They never found my foot. I don't imagine they ever will. Life slowly returned to normal as it could be after what I went through. I told everyone it was just an intruder, a sick, twisted individual that I didn't recognize. I insisted on selling the house. Max agreed without argument. We threw out every shoe I owned during the move, and I only bought 2 more pairs to get me through day-to-day life. I keep them in the living room at all times. Max thinks I should see a therapist. He's probably right. I'm scared that if I do, I'll open up about everything, tell the whole truth. I'm not sure I can, not out loud. But I'm adjusting, I'm living. That's the most I can hope for. Max is supportive, and our new home is lovely. That's all I need. Or at least, I thought so. Now, I'm not so sure. Because this morning, I realized my right sneaker wasn't by the door where I left it. The only reason I did it was because I thought it'd be funny. People prank new employees all the time, don't they? And it wasn't like I expected her to fall for it. I just wanted us to break the ice and share a few laughs. Working at the gas station convenience store was slow, especially after midnight, and I just wanted to leave her in good spirits. I was alone in the store that evening, bored out of my mind as I waited for the new girl Mr. Sahir told me to train. As I daydreamed, my eyes wandered over the yellow paper signs Mr. Sahir had taped up on the wall. No stealing allowed, no guns allowed, no knives allowed, no smoking allowed, no arguing allowed, no damaging property allowed. You get the idea. Everything you don't want in your gas station and store was typed out and taped up. There were dozens of yellow paper signs, all overlapping. I didn't think the customers could even read them, yet we never had any of the problems posted. So they must have done the trick somehow. It was those signs that gave me an idea. Instead of rules for customers, I could make up a rules list for the new hire and pretend all of us employees had to follow it. Hilarious ideas were already popping into my mind, and I grabbed my phone and jotted them down. I ended up with the following: Sahir's gas, guzzle and go, graveyard shift rules. 1. When you start your shift at 12 a.m., you must turn the radio on. Tune it between any two stations so that they overlap and play it at a medium volume. 2. If you hear a soccer game being announced in enthusiastic Spanish from outside, you must grab the vuvuzela from under the counter and blow as hard as you can for 20 seconds. 3. A thick purple liquid will periodically ooze from beneath the soda fridge. Do not mop it. Instead, crush salt and vinegar chips and sprinkle them over the puddle. Once it turns a pale gray, place appropriate signs around the puddle and leave it to harden. At the end of your shift, crack the brittle remains, sweep them up, and throw them away. 4. If you smell lutefisk at any time, you must leave your post immediately, hide in the bathroom, turn off the lights, and hum the Titanic song. Once you are done, it is safe to exit. 5. Every Thursday, a large woman with braces and half a mustache will enter the store and ask about Joe. You must nod and point towards pump 4. Do not speak to her. Do not make any sounds. Remain silent still until she exits. 6. If it is a full moon, take a newspaper, spread it out on the floor beside the ice freezer outside, and sprinkle Skittles on top. Once done, go back inside. At the end of your shift, check the newspaper. If the Skittles are still there, throw everything away. If an odorless black substance is left in their place, wear gloves. Collect it in an empty water bottle and close it tight before throwing everything away. 7. On the 3rd of every month, a fluorescent orange Hummer will stop at pump 1 and honk 3 times. You must run out immediately and dance the jig as you fill their car with $100 of gas. Once done, the driver's side window will open a crack and 2 $100 bills will slide out. Accept them with a curtsy. Remain outside until the Hummer drives away and is out of sight. 8. A 7-year-old girl wearing a cowboy hat while chewing tobacco may drop by between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. If she doesn't speak, ignore her, and she will leave in a few minutes. If she starts yodeling, you must clap and stomp to the rhythm of We Will Rock You by Queen until she is done. 9. At exactly 4:44 a.m., you will hear rustling from the chip stand. Ignore it. If the rustling continues past 5 a.m., or if it turns into crunching, you must burp. If you cannot produce one, fake one. Continue burping until the rustling or the crunching stops. 10. Sir Riss drops by on windless dawns. He will select a tabloid magazine and a pack of cigarettes. If he requests menthol, carry on as usual. If he requests otherwise, you must open the pack of cigarettes, break each stick, pile the tobacco on the magazine, and arrange them artistically. You must then stop back and let Sir Riss appraise your work. If he snorts the tobacco, nod and ring up his items. If he hocks a loogie on the floor, you must try again. See? They are completely ridiculous and utterly harmless rules. I still wanted the list to look legit at first glance though, so I went to Mr. Sahir's office and printed it out on the same yellow paper he used for his signs. I then creased it, frayed the edges, and even left coffee stains here and there to give it a well-worn look. The girl came by around 11:30 p.m. and I knew right away she'd get a kick out of the rules. She had a punk rock thing going on and she dropped her motorcycle helmet on the counter with a playful smirk as she introduced herself as Brooke. After some back and forth, some training, and some flirting, I gave her the list. I put on my most solemn expression as I stressed how important it was to follow them. And she read them with one eyebrow cocked, her smile growing until she burst into laughter. "Do any of the new employees fall for this?" she asked, looking up at me with a chuckle. "I actually wrote it just for you," I replied, trying to stop myself from grinning like a moron. She tilted her head, her eyes twinkling. "Then how about you give me your number in case anything happens, since you forgot to write it down?" I don't think I could have said my phone number any faster. "So is there really a vuvuzela back here?" she asked as she walked around and peeked under the counter. "Haha, no, we keep it in the back," I joked. She smiled and sat down, propping her legs up. "So, Miles, are you leaving, or will you stay and help me face the yodeling cowgirls and purple puddles?" I really wanted to stay, but I had an early class tomorrow. "No, I've given you enough training, young Padawan. Now I leave this fortress in your hands. I won't fail you. I know." I tried to be suave as I flung my bag on my shoulder, but I knocked over a box of chocolates and spent a few minutes collecting them with a red face as she laughed. I put everything back, shot her a tight smile, and ran out of the store, beating myself up for being such a klutz. But apparently she was into klutzes, because she texted me once I got home. I had to dig through backup files on my cloud to find these texts since I lost my phone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. From Brooke. "Hey, check it out, rule numero uno." I played an 11-second clip. Message sent at 12:20 a.m. She'd recorded a little message of the overlapping radio stations, and that was it for me. I knew she was the one. We chatted for almost an hour before I worked up the courage to ask her out. From me. "How about coffee tomorrow before your shift?" Sent at 1:12 a.m. From Brooke. "Boy, you really went all out." Haha. "Okay, rub it in. Dinner instead." LOL. "No, I mean the lady. How much did you pay her to wear half a mustache?" Haha, what? LOL, she's actually got braces. Is she gonna ask me about Joe now? She did. This is a riot. I love it. So, should I point to pump number 4? Or do I clap for a good performance or what? I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you pranking me back or something? Hello? If she's really there, take a picture. Earth to Brooke. Okay, you got me. It's a good prank, haha. Brooke, I'm serious. Text me back. 1:36 a.m. I stopped messaging after that. I didn't want to get all grumpy in the chat. I loved a good prank, but I was upset she started it, just as I was asking her out. At first, I thought that was her subtle way of saying she wasn't interested, even though she'd been super blunt the entire time we were talking. But then, I figured she just wanted the last laugh, and I didn't want to give it to her. I knew I had early classes, but my pride was more important. I never backed down from a prank war. I grabbed my keys and I drove back over to see Here's Gas Guzzling Go. After parking beside Brooke's motorcycle, I found the loudest Spanish soccer announcer possible and blared the video through my car's speakers, leaving the engine running. I snuck over and peeked through the store window, trying to stop myself from giggling as I imagined Brooke searching in panic for the Vuvuzela. She wasn't behind the counter. Her bag and motorcycle helmet were still on top though. I walked in and the radio was still playing the overlapping station. I made my way to the back, but Brooke wasn't there either. Frowning, I returned to my car and shut everything down before checking the motorcycle. It had to be hers. It was the only vehicle here other than mine. Believing she'd taken the prank to the extreme, I walked back inside and announced that she was the prank queen and she could come out now. And that was when I noticed the thick purple puddle oozing from beneath the soda fridge. At the time, I couldn't believe Brooke went to all of these lengths. I had no idea what she could have used to make the slime that purple and gooey. So I poked it with my foot, and I gasped as my shoe began sizzling. I jerked back, dropping my phone as I yanked my shoe off. The slime had eaten through the sole and singed my sock, but it hadn't contacted my skin yet. I looked down in fearful bewilderment, and I gawked at the sight of my phone, or what remained of it. Pieces of plastic, metal, and glass dissolving in the glowing, pulsating puddle. This couldn't be Brooke's doing, unless she was a psychopath. What even was this substance? And it was at this moment that a terrible odor filled the store. I gagged and pulled my collar over my nose and mouth, but it wasn't enough as I felt my dinner rising up. I ran to the bathroom, slammed the door, and vomited in the toilet. After my retching became unproductive, I leaned against the wall, and I froze when I heard heavy creaking coming from outside. Holding my breath to avoid the putrid smell, I placed my ear against the door, and my blood ran cold when I heard a deep, thudding heartbeat resonating beneath the creaks. Goosebumps spread across my skin as the heartbeat got louder and the creaking became more rapid, and a new sound joined the terrifying chorus. Gurgled breathing. As if that wasn't enough to make me piss my pants, freezing water began seeping from beneath the door. I yelped and clambered up onto the toilet, trembling as I tried to figure out what was going on. This couldn't be Brooke. But if this wasn't her, then who was it? And what happened to Brooke? The water had already covered the floor of the tiny bathroom, and I covered my mouth when I saw dead fish floating on its surface. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have my phone. There was no one around. The gurgled breathing got more and more labored as the creaking sped up and the heartbeat amplified, and I began hyperventilating, which just filled my lungs with the rancid smell hovering around me. Lutefisk. The smell was lutefisk. I recognized it from when my cousin tried and failed to make that fickle dish. My thoughts went back to the list in disbelief. The purple puddle, the lutefisk, the half-mustachioed lady that Brooke mentioned. I had no idea how any of this was possible, and a small part of me still hoped this was all an elaborate prank to make a fool of myself. But I caved. Stretching my arm, I turned off the lights and remained balanced on the toilet as I hummed the Titanic song to the best of my ability. It had been years since I'd heard it, and I worried it wouldn't be enough. But to my terrified delight, the gurgled breathing now turned into gurgled humming as I gained an eerie duet partner. As we hummed, the creaking slowed down and the thudding pulse ebbed, and I took a tearful breath of relief when the overpowering stench of lutefisk was replaced by that of my own vomit still chilling in the toilet. After I hummed the last note, I held my breath and waited. It was dead silent. I turned on the lights. The floor was bone dry, not a fish to be seen. Climbing down, I flushed my mess with a shaky hand as I looked at my sweaty face in the mirror. My eyes widened with utter stupefaction. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. It was late. I'd been working all day, and I hadn't been sleeping well. It made more sense than accepting that I'd had a duet with a disembodied drowning voice. I walked out. Everything seemed fine. I made my way to the counter. The list was there, right beside Brooke's bag and helmet, and her phone. On the floor, there was a yellow puddle, urine. Everything was not fine. Something had terrified Brooke enough for her to leave everything and run. Unless... No, I don't want to think about that. I nearly jumped out of my skin when a loud horn honked 3 times, and I turned to the window, and my jaw fell open when I saw a fluorescent orange Hummer parked at Pump 1. I didn't know how, but everything on my list seemed to be coming true. A Hummer was driven by people. They weren't disembodied sounds from behind a door. I could talk to them, see how all of this was possible. I approached the vehicle with hesitant steps, and with a deep breath, I knocked on the tinted window of the driver's side. The moment my knuckles touched the glass, they fused to it. Panicking, I tried to yank my hand away, but the window just seemed to suck it in. I yelled for help as I banged my other fist against the glass, only for that hand to meld as well. My heart fluttered in my chest as I struggled, but everything I did just made my situation worse. Finding myself elbows deep, and I did the only thing I could think of. I jigged. The more I hopped, shimmied, and kicked, the more the window released my arms, and I stumbled away when I regained my freedom. Terrified of what else could happen, I continued to dance as I filled up the tank with $100 worth of gas. While still jigging, I stood by the window, and I accepted the $200 bills with a curtsy before I remained outside until they drove out of my view. Panting with exertion and apprehension, I made my way back inside and I gasped at the size of the throbbing purple puddle. It had taken up an entire quarter of the store. I rushed towards the chip aisle in a frantic frenzy, ripping open the salt and vinegar chips, crushing them and flinging the crumbs over the slime. Even after I depleted the entire salt and vinegar section, the puddle still hadn't changed color. Desperately, I crushed the salted chips and poured vinegar over them before I hurled the soggy concoction over the ooze. After half an hour, I fell to my knees in exhausted relief when the puddle finally turned to a pale gray. I wished I had time to breathe after that, because a little girl in a cowboy hat walked through the door, spitting tobacco on the chip bag littered floor. I froze, drawing a blank at the worst possible moment. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. The list was on the counter, but I didn't know if I should move or not. I stayed on my knees, watching her peruse the aisles, as if it was perfectly natural for a kid to be shopping at 3:15 a.m. She began yodeling, but my memory continued to fail me. I stared at her, twitching, not sure what I should do. She glared at me as her yodeling became more shrill, and I winced. Doing nothing wasn't working, so I took the chance and inched my way towards the counter, only to yelp as a whip snapped in front of me. I turned to the girl in shock, and I backed away in horror. Whips had replaced her arms, and her body had elongated like a snake, several more whip-like appendages sprouting from her sides. Her yodeling had now become a high-pitched hiss as another whip snapped beside me, and I scrambled up and ran in the opposite direction, locking myself in Mr. Sayeer's office. His computer worked, and I managed to look up the list on my cloud. Clap and stomp to We Will Rock You. How could I forget? I began clapping and stomping to the rhythm as loud as I could, sweat cascading down my already glazed face as I feared it was too late. She was done yodeling. This wasn't going to work anymore. I sank into a chair, out of breath and near a mental breakdown as I closed my eyes. The hissing, beyond intolerable. That's where I am now, hiding in Mr. Sayeer's office, with tissues stuffed in my bleeding ears. There's no phone in here, but I did post on all my social media accounts. Help is on the way, but I don't know if they'll get to me in time, or if they'll be able to stop the hissing whip snake girl, or any of the other horrors I'd inadvertently created. I don't know what happened to Brooke. I just hope she made it somewhere safe. If I'm not found in time, I just wanted to get this out. Brooke, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It had been 2 months ago when I began to notice the changes. It wasn't anything particularly nerve-wracking, as it had started with other people. Complete strangers I had never even spoken a word to, but saw regularly on my daily commute to work. People who I swear looked a very specific way every time I saw them before, but now looked different. It wasn't major changes, only small things that you wouldn't notice until the back of your brain suddenly realized the change. And by then, the people had already rounded a corner, out of sight where you couldn't check again. I convinced myself it had to have been my imagination, or maybe the person had gotten surgery. I mean, I didn't know the financial situation of random people on the street, so I guessed it was possible someone could have gotten a mole removed from their cheek. Or maybe I only thought they had a scar on the left side of their forehead. It's not like I saw them every day, so they could have had time to get beautification done, with no one being the wiser. I put it in the back of my mind every time I noticed it, coming to the conclusion that I shouldn't be getting involved in other people's business. I had my own to deal with at work. I had my own life I needed to worry about. That was until I began noticing the same sort of changes in my coworkers. Delilah was first, and by far the most obvious. A very lovely and kind-hearted woman in her mid-50s, sporting crow's feet as well as an obvious eye made of glass. The original lost to cancer. She loved her glass eye and made sure to get it in a different color than her working one. So whenever she came by to have a chat with me during our break, or just brought me some coffee in my favorite mug, I'd always see that bright red eye from all the way down the hall. But now, it's gone. And in its place is a vibrant blue eye, matching the other one. It wasn't as if she had gotten another glass eye or anything of that sort. That thing was looking around, blinking, and the scars of her surgery to remove it in the first place weren't even there. Her crow's feet were also barely noticeable. It was like the clock rolled back 10 years for her. Fred's golden tooth was gone the next day, replaced with a perfectly normal one. When I asked him about it, he just looked at me with confusion and said he didn't know what I was talking about. Needless to say, I was very freaked out when I went home that night. I knew if I told Jack, my boyfriend, he wouldn't believe me. He'd just think, damn, Gary's losing his mind. First the people on the street looking different, and now his coworkers. Better dump him. So I didn't mention it, and just told him I got in an argument with a random guy on the way back home when he asked. I know what I saw, and last time I checked, I wasn't a damn schizo, so obviously something bad is going on. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, not by a long shot. Have you ever seen your reflection from far away? It doesn't matter where. It could be a weird angle. It could be at any time. But if you're not expecting it, you freeze, and your mind goes into the mental overdrive as it's trying to figure out why a person who looks just like you is now just staring you down. I'd been getting out of the corner shop near my workplace when I first saw me just walking down the road in some skinny jeans and a hoodie with a large frowny face on the middle. They looked bored, their hair short with the sides nearly completely bald. They even had the small scar on the tip of their nose that I had gotten when I was a kid. They didn't notice me, or if they did, they completely ignored me as they walked past a corner. I was completely stunned, but then that little inner voice in the back of my mind screamed, "No, this can't be happening. That's not me. Man up, Gary, and follow them. Make sure that's not you." I did as my brain said after working up the courage. It's like I'm just gonna let that slide on by without me doing anything about it. So I followed, and I rounded the corner hoping to God they weren't there, or they looked different enough that I could sigh in relief. But they were still there. In fact, they were on the phone with someone. Their voice was mine. The way they talked was how I talked. Everything was just exactly me. It was like I had been playing a first-person game all of my life, and suddenly turned into third person. It was hard to tell who they were talking to, but with each sentence the other me spoke, I was able to slowly piece it together. They were talking to Mickey, one of my exes. It had to be. The other me was asking about how the gym business was going, and Mickey owned a gym. But the problem was, I broke up with Mickey 5 years ago, and he sold his gym the same year we broke up. So what the hell is this identical version of me doing, ringing my ex and asking about their defunct business? I mean, sure, Mickey and I broke up on not the best of terms, but I don't dislike the guy enough that I'd rub his past business failures in his face or anything. I followed them for what felt like hours. It probably was just half an hour though. The sun was just setting when they finally reached their destination. I was just glad they didn't arrive at my apartment building or anything, but it was a place I remembered. It was the place I was staying at before I met Jack, when I was going out with Mickey, and when I was still going to college. I decided to move in with Jack because I didn't feel safe there. I swear that place was haunted, or someone was stalking me. It always felt like I was being watched by something. I stopped following when they went inside. I mean, what else was I gonna do? Barge in? Ask him why we look alike? That wouldn't end well. So I went home, pretended like nothing happened, and thought that was it. But I kept seeing me out in the street, and each time I saw me, I just couldn't help but follow them from a distance. Always until they returned home. Sometimes I told Jack I was going out for a walk at night, but really, I just felt like I needed to keep an eye on that other me. I'd go to their apartment and watch them through the window. I didn't trust them. They could be planning to come after me. I mean, why else were random people on the street suddenly looking different? Why did Delilah suddenly have her eye back? People are getting replaced by themselves, or something pretending to be them, and I'm not going to let some doppelganger take over my life. So that's where I am now. I don't really know what to do. I don't know who I should tell, or even if I can tell anyone about this. They would think I'm crazy, even though I'm not. I've been watching myself for the past 2 months now, but I don't know what else I should do. I need to prepare in the chance they decide it's time to murder me and take my place without Jack being any the wiser. I was thinking I should go on the offensive, make sure they can't hurt me by doing them in first. But I don't know if I can actually go through with that. Please, tell me what I should do. I don't even care if you believe me or not. I just need to know what I need to do, so I don't end up dead with no one caring, because there's a fake me taking over my life. At this point, I'm starting to really wish I'm just losing my grip with reality. It all started when we moved into our new home. It was a pretty small town, not much to do except go to the movie theater or the diner. I don't know why I'm saying all of this. I'm not the type of guy to hang out with friends or family, or even socialize for that matter. Maybe it's because it eats me up inside. The portal. The other world. Despite the mood of the town, and my inability to not talk that much, I managed to meet and befriend 2 other people from my new school. Their names are Jessica and Lucas. They were both loners as well, I guess you could say, hence our meeting. We used to hang out a lot, like really a lot, both before and after school. They were not new to town. but they totally understood me when I confessed. Although I'm not currently at my best self, I sometimes have flashbacks of the cool little things we did together. Some of you might not get very excited, but the sleepovers and the late night talks, the pizza, and the video games were all things that enhanced our bond in so many ways. We also had fun exploring new places like abandoned buildings, dead silent streets, and forests. Forests are my favorite places to explore. One good thing about this town is that it's full of them. Anyways, about the town. At first, I didn't think much about the weirdness it had. By weirdness, I mean mostly the people. The teachers at school, the cashiers, the bartenders. Hell, even some kids my age had this odd vibe where they either didn't talk much, or when they did, it just seemed forced. Not all of the people had it, but it was pretty obvious some did. Jess and Lucas were completely normal. When we hung out, it seemed like the world was ours, like as if the only people around were us three. Nobody else mattered. I mentioned earlier the words portal and other world. Well, I didn't usually like to talk about that, but recording about it seems different. I'm sure it will sound like complete nonsense, as if it was a fabricated story. I'm not in the state to force people to believe me if they don't want to at this point. It was a Friday night. We were at Lucas's place and had planned to sleep over at his house. And yes, Jess was there. We also had planned to watch a couple of horror films before we went to sleep, but that never happened. Actually, after consuming 2 or 3 energy drinks each, we wanted to get outside so bad. Thoughts of places to go were running in my head, but to no avail. After the dumb ideas that I suggested, Jess just opted to go for a walk, hoping that we'd find something on our way. It was 12 a.m., and Lucas's mom was asleep, so it was easy to sneak out. With so much adrenaline running through our bodies, we just wanted to do something stupid. I thought of Ding Dong Ditch. We had played it before. It was way more fun than you'd imagine. Because of all the elders in our neighborhood, we snuck out of a window in Lucas's room and proceeded to approach the nearest house. Lucas all of the sudden stormed ahead of us, shoving us and running for the doorbell. He gave it a good 4 hits, and then ran to find the nearest cover. All 3 of us hid behind the house's bushes and waited for the door. A small, elderly man came out. I didn't quite see him because of the darkness of the front porch. He stood there for about 10 seconds, then went back inside. Lucas again ran to the front porch and rang the doorbell 2 more times. Not even 2 seconds later, the man opened the door and grabbed Lucas by his shirt, dragging him inside. I couldn't believe it. It happened so quickly, and I was truly worried. I still remember that. But the elderly man? How? How did he perform these actions in the amount of time it takes me to snap my fingers? He seemed as if he had predicted it. But then again, he had to be around 70 years old. That was weird. Jess and I decided to sneak up to the door, as it was still ajar. As we went to go grab the elderly man who was pushing Lucas now, he slammed the door in our faces, almost as fast as he had snagged Lucas. Something is very off, I thought. I attempted to open the door, and oddly, it opened. We were inside, but the man was nowhere to be found, and neither was Lucas. Impossible. Right after they left the porch, they were gone? Jess was just as shocked as I was. I could see it in her eyes. We honestly didn't have the time or the strength to ask any questions. we just proceeded inside. We didn't exchange many words after that. Right then, all I had in my mind was, how? Why? And we need to find them. We spent a good 2 hours searching there, waiting for something to happen. We knew no one else was inside that man's house. We searched all of it. At this point, it was 2 a.m., and the only place we hadn't searched yet was the backyard of the house. Jessica and I proceeded to the backyard. We immediately made eye contact as soon as we heard it. It was a creaking sound coming from the shed. No movement though, just the sound. I first thought I was hallucinating when I saw the purple lights coming out of the door of the shed. We started walking towards the shed as if it was controlling our pace and channeling us there. Just as a bug is drawn to a light. Jess was right behind me when I opened the door. Right before I did that, for some reason, the darkest and the happiest moments of my life crossed my mind in a split second. The fear of changing towns, the absence of my father since I was a toddler, seeing Jess and Lucas for the first time. I thought I was about to die, but there was no going back then. When I landed my hand on the door, Jess held my other hand, and now I believe that explains how she teleported with me. When I opened the door and we stepped inside, it appeared that there was no inside at all. As soon as we took that step, we were back outside again, but it was a different outside. The first thing that I noticed before telling Jess was the sky. It was red. Also, everything around us was blurry, like we had myopia. After trying to adjust to our new surroundings, I attempted to walk. With every step Jess and I took, there was an echoing sound of it. The whole experience was terrifying. From the moment Lucas was lost, everything seemed to change. My body was in a constant fight or flight mode, and I felt as if I was about to collapse on the floor. There seemed to be no life in this other world, but not long after, we heard crows flying over us in the blood-red sky. As we were observing them, we understood that they were trying to tell us something. They continuously flew over the top of the house, like they wanted us to go there. I looked at Jess and beckoned that we go inside. We slowly entered the back door. Inside of the house was even darker, and as we began walking, we heard echoes from the kitchen. Just then, we saw from the gap of the kitchen door the elderly man eating. From what we could see, he was alone, and he was acting kind of normal at least. I looked away for 2 seconds, and as I looked back, the elderly man opened the door. Jess and I were shaking in fear, but he didn't seem to care we were there, like he couldn't even see us. A feeling of relief ran through my body, and he walked upstairs, disappearing into the dark. Jess and I then proceeded to look for Lucas on the first floor. We had no luck until we opened the front door, where we saw Lucas lying on his back on the front porch. We tried to talk to him, but he didn't answer. We proceeded to shake him, with the same result. We finally decided to just grab him and head back to the shed. We knew it was our only exit from this hell. As we were heading out the back door to head towards the shed, we heard footsteps behind us, moving rapidly, as if someone was attempting to chase us. When we looked back, it was the elderly man. We don't know why he was chasing us, but we knew it had something to do with Lucas. The elderly man was an arm length away from us when we stepped into the shed. We managed to escape. After that night, I never wanted to enter that portal again. I still struggle to explain most of what happened, but Jess, Lucas, and I conclude it was an alternate reality or alternate dimension, a parallel universe where things do not happen the same way they do on Earth, and we had the luck, or the curse, to have a glimpse of that. As for Lucas, he was okay when we returned, confused, but okay. We agreed to not tell anyone else what happened that night, and we never did. Well, except me now sharing this. I couldn't bear to keep something so big and important to myself. Some may believe that that's the only entrance to another dimension, that there are no other doors to that parallel universe. But you never know what you might find. So whatever you do not want to mess with these kinds of things. No human should. And if you ever encounter them, you have to be very careful, or just stay away. Because if you don't, that parallel universe may just become your reality. I found this written on a sheet of yellow paper on the floor when I moved into my new house. My landlord informed me that the previous homeowner went missing under mysterious circumstances 6 months before I bought this house. I'm posting this here as a reminder to always be careful online. Sometimes, following your recommendations can take you to weird places. After finishing my shift last Saturday night, all I felt like doing was collapsing on my bed and watching some YouTube while I fell asleep. As soon as I got home, I slammed the door shut and tumbled into my bed. My eyes were almost closed as I unlocked my phone and picked out a random video on my recommended page. The video was by some channel I'd never heard of, and was some sort of Pulp Fiction narration or creepypasta reading. I'm not usually one for creepy stories. I much prefer watching lighthearted videos in my free time. But on this occasion, it didn't really matter what I was watching, since I was so out of it already. I'm not really sure why, but it just feels wrong to sleep without noise in the background. Ever since I was a kid, I've always had some sort of sound going while I slept. When I was 3, my parents bought me a white noise machine, and I used it up until my first phone. If the noise stops or gets too quiet, I wake up. I've never known why. That's just the way I am. Anyway, I always have autoplay on, so the sound doesn't stop for too long. I guess it doesn't really matter what ends up playing, since I'm not really watching it. But it's a funny thought. What kinds of videos play while I sleep? What if the audio enters my mind and implants dark, subliminal thoughts in the night? Maybe I'm just being paranoid about that. But whatever happened mere minutes ago has me shaking. It's the reason I'm recording this right now, scrunched up behind my bed's headboard. At some point in the night, I woke up. It must have been around 1:30 a.m. I noticed that I could barely hear the video, which must have been the reason my sleep ended so abruptly. I groggily opened my eyes and sat up. I saw the dim light of my phone screen shining up from the floor beneath. I groaned and picked it up off of the ground and saw the video I was on. It was a video with 0 views. I wondered how many videos it took me to get here. The first video I'd clicked on had about 100,000 views. The video title was Nighttime Exploration. The description consisted of only one word: hey. Confused, I tapped on the screen. That's when I noticed that something was wrong with the video. I could see the amount of time that I had already watched, but not how much was left. I had only been watching it for 9 seconds, but I had no idea how long the full video was. At first, I wondered if I was actually watching the live stream, but thoroughly examining the description and everything around the video, I found there was no indication of this being live. I decided to watch it, because I was awake by now and fairly intrigued. I had to stare at my screen for a few seconds before I realized what I was looking at. The camera was pointing at a door. More specifically, it was pointing at a doorknob. The video was oddly silent. I had to crank up the volume to the maximum to hear anything at all. What I heard was breathing. The breathing was permissibly that of the cameraman. It was scratchy and deep, and sounded uneven, like he had ran several miles to get to the door. I almost skipped to the next video in my recommendations when I saw nothing was happening, but right as my thumb was hovering over the next thumbnail, I noticed something on the screen. The camera shook as a hand which belonged to the cameraman emerged into view and wrapped itself around the doorknob. The hand seemed larger than normal and was wearing a black glove. The glove had rubber on the palms and fingers, which allowed the hand to open the door. As the door swung open in the video, I heard a small squeak come from my phone speakers. At the same time, I thought I heard a similar noise come from downstairs. I quickly turned my volume all the way down, but I didn't hear anything else. I figured I was just being paranoid and turned the volume back up. The door was now open, and the building whoever this was had stepped in was dark. Clearly, it was night on the video too. We appeared to be in an entryway to a small house, with a small hallway leading to a small living room, in which stood a flight of wooden stairs. Everything was extremely difficult to make out, since the video was so dark, and because I was sitting in a dark room myself, and I was a bit drowsy. Luckily, the mysterious cameraman stood still for long enough in each place for me to take a good look at it. If he hadn't, there was no way I could have properly observed everything in the frame, since as soon as I realized, there wasn't an option to pause the video. The small triangle in the middle of the screen was grayed out and didn't work for some reason. Again, I thought this was odd but didn't really think about it. I was still tired for some reason. I was extremely curious as to where this would go. The cameraman began walking slowly through the hallway. His breathing became even more labored as he moved, covering up even the sounds of his footsteps in the video audio. Again, I thought I heard noises coming from downstairs, but I tried my best to ignore them. That was a mistake. As the man moved through the dark house, I began to notice some striking similarities between the house in the video and my own place of residence. The layout of the house was very similar to mine. The living room and the stairs were in the exact same place as mine were. What really scared me was what happened when the gloved man reached the end of the hallway. Right next to him was a long mahogany cabinet. The cabinet was the exact same as the one my grandmother had given me when I moved in a year ago, and on it was an old green vase I'd bought when I first got the cabinet. That was it. This was too uncanny. I looked up and realized that I had left my door wide open. It was pitch black in the house. The only light visible was that on my phone screen. I felt a weird chill run down my body, despite being wrapped up in a blanket. I wanted to believe this all was a nightmare, or just some weird coincidence, but none of it made sense. Everything was just too similar. I decided it was time to turn off the video. However, when I tapped on the phone screen to bring up the option to leave the video, nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. I was frozen on the video. I couldn't leave. At this point, waves of terrifying thoughts were crashing through my head. Part of me was scared half to death, and the other part of me wanted to believe this whole experience was somehow all my imagination. Yet somehow, I was still glued to the video. Or rather, I was glued to the live stream. As I was now convinced this was, I still held to some stupid hope that I was just going crazy or was just being overly paranoid. For some reason, I kept watching. The man was now standing in front of the vase. In absolute terror, I looked on as the gloved hand again appeared as the cameraman reached out towards it. For the first time, I saw the mysterious man's arm. It was dressed in black, but the material his clothes was made out of was difficult to determine. He slowly reached out and rested his hand on the smooth glass of the vase. His hand rested there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds. His breathing only grew louder as he just stood there, and with the camera pointing at the glass object. Suddenly, the hand raised up and forcibly shoved the vase over and off of the cabinet. He quickly moved the camera to show the vase falling to the floor. It broke into 1,000 pieces on the wood and created a resounding crash. This was what broke me out of my trance, because the noise didn't come from the video. I heard it, clear as day, from right beneath my bed. It was loud, and it was enough to completely wake me up and put me on full alert. I managed to turn the volume all the way down again with shaking fingers and picked it up. I beamed the light from the screen down at the floor, using it as a flashlight to see where I was stepping. I was too afraid to point it up at all, for fear that the person who had broken into my house would realize I was awake, or that I knew he was there. I carefully slid out of my bed. Every second seemed amplified in the darkness. As I slowly stood up, I listened out for other noises in the house. I thought I heard breathing and heavy footsteps, but that could have been my mind playing tricks on me. Now that I was sure there was someone in my house, my imagination was running wild, trying to distract me. I began making my way towards the open door at the end of the room. My footsteps on the carpeted floor seemed to echo through the house, even though they probably weren't even noticeable downstairs. I had carefully dodged all the miscellaneous items that had been strewn about on the floor like I was traversing a minefield. If I made even one noise that was too loud, I would probably have had a heart attack from the stress. I couldn't bear the thought of whoever was downstairs charging up to me. I managed to reach the door and started to close it. I went as slow as I could to avoid making a sound. As the door was halfway closed, it unexpectedly creaked. I quickly held the door in its place, too scared to move a muscle. I listened out into the house for any indication that they had heard it, but I heard and saw nothing. I painstakingly continued shutting the door. I had made it past the creak in the hinges and closed it silently. The door was now only barely cracked open, and all I had to do was fully close and lock it. After much deliberation, I decided the best course of action was to just slam the door and lock it as fast as I could. I just had to hope that the intruder wouldn't break the door down. I sucked in a deep breath and closed the door all the way. In the complete silence, the sound resounded throughout the entire house. Still tense, I locked it and crept back to my bed. I felt slightly safer now that my door was locked. I sat down on top of my covers and looked back at my phone. Now, all I could do was wait and watch. The man was now in the doorway of my kitchen, panning the camera back and forth across the room. After a while, he took a step into the room. The camera turned to the right and revealed my set of kitchen knives. Again, the hand came out and grabbed the handle of the biggest knife. My breath stopped. Sweat was pouring down my face, and I was just hoping that this night would end. I had no idea why this was happening to me. I didn't know why I couldn't leave the video. All I wanted was to be alone in my house. By now, I was wondering if the intruder knew I was here. Maybe he thought I wasn't home, or thought I was asleep. I held on to that little hope that I had that advantage. But if he thought he was alone, why would he grab the knife? I looked around the room for any kind of weapon. The closest thing I could find was the lamp on my nightstand. After confirming my weapon's location, I shuddered and checked the man's position. He was now walking through the living room again. I turned the volume up and leaned in, listening for anything. As I did this, I thought I heard a faint chuckle. It was very quiet, but noticeable. The intruder walked slowly through the room. I noticed that he was walking somewhat unevenly, since the camera was shaking. I figured the man must have had a limp. The cameraman's steps were so slow that I checked the clock to see how long I had been watching. I determined that I had been suffering through this video for over half an hour. At last, the man reached the foot of my stairs. He laboriously lifted his foot onto the first step, then the next one, then the next. I could see my door slowly come into frame as he ascended the stairs. He was climbing the steps to my room. I had never felt this level of fear before. The thought of an unknown assailant climbing the stairs right outside of my door shook me to the bones. I wondered what I would do when he got here. Would he try to break in? How would I fight him with nothing but a lamp? I can't call the police. My phone was frozen on this stupid video. I was trapped. It only took a minute for the man to reach the top of the stairs, but it felt like 1,000 lifetimes passed before he was at my door. The whole time, I could hear his footsteps, clear as day, only a few feet away from me. The video showed him taking a few steps until he was standing mere inches away from it. Then, angling the camera to point at the doorknob just as he did at the beginning, the video kept going for several seconds, pointing at my door. Then, the video ended. The audio stopped, and the screen was completely frozen on the shot of the doorknob. I could now hear the quiet sounds of a man breathing on the other side of the door. I beamed the light of my phone down at the bottom of the door. Sure enough, 2 long, distinct shadows confirmed my worst fear. The man was standing at my door. Alone and out of options, I decided to just hide. That's how I ended up here now, squeezed between my wall and my bed's headboard, writing this out on a piece of paper. My room doesn't have any windows. The only way out is through the door that my intruder is blocking. I can't leave. I've tried everything. I can't turn off my phone. I can't leave the video. I'm trapped. It's been hours, and he won't leave. My only choices are to stay in here or fight. And I sure as hell can't fight him. If anyone finds this, I'm already gone. Please, just heed my warning. Be careful on the internet. You never know what you might find. Yes, I'm a retail sales employee. I've been working here for a few months, and there's a lot of rules I have to follow, along with some strange stories to go along with them. I guess I should give you a little background about me. My name is Justin Collins, but you guys can call me JC for short. I'm 18, and I've just finished high school. I've only been able to move out of my parents' house a few months ago, after I scraped up some money with some odd jobs. The only reason I am working at this place is for the pay and the occasional hottie, though it doesn't happen as much as you think, since this store is near the poorer side of town. There's also the matter of the overdue rent I consistently forget to pay, but I guess that my unfunny jokes don't really matter. I should just get on with my story. Rule number 1, don't fall asleep. Pretty easy sounding first rule, huh? Not really, since I work the night shift. At all my earlier jobs before I started this one, it was pretty easy to sleep on the job on the regular. But this job isn't regular. My first encounter with this rule was about a week after getting this job. I was casually sitting on a seat, waiting for a customer to up and walk in. Though as the minutes passed without a customer, and the exhaustion finally catching up with me, I started to doze off. Now, there's something I didn't mention before. This store isn't completely normal, to say the least. So if this sounds fake, trust me, it isn't. I was in the halfway point between sleep and being awake. Just as I was about to pass out, I heard a small voice in my head start singing a lullaby. A lullaby, yeah. You heard it here first, folks. Anyways, it was a quiet voice, not mine. Sounded like a female, maybe early 20-ish. This lullaby lady starts humming a song that I have no clue the name of. It was like, as I was falling asleep, the voice would get louder and louder, though it was clear something was off about the voice. It didn't sound real. You could say, like it was being imitated. I felt a large jerk in my shoulder, and I recoiled. By pure luck, I was saved. Sometimes during my half-awake, half-asleep state, I'll have an occasional jerk that'll wake me up completely. I had barely noticed at the time, but almost as soon as I woke up, the voice had dissipated. I thought about telling the manager, but knowing her, if I did, I would either get fired or get yelled at. I want neither of those. So I decided to keep this encounter to myself and allowed it to never happen again. Although, that was the first sign that this retail store wasn't normal. Rule number 2. If someone tells you there's somebody selling hot dogs from inside the store, tell the manager immediately. Rule 2 is probably the third most strange one from the list of rules. The first time I heard it, I audibly said, "The hell are we, a circus crew?" The manager at the time was within listening range and properly reprimanded me, although I did deserve it for being a stupid kid. I had probably been working at this store for a week and a half at this point, and knowing the do not sleep rule and how strict the manager is, I decided to actually be a good employee and follow the rules. It was midnight and I was stocking the shelves when suddenly I felt a tender hand grab my shoulder. I quickly turned around and realized it was a girl, maybe the same age as me. She had a slight blush to her face that gave her face a reddish pink look to it, and brown, wavy hair that flowed long past her back. She was wearing one of those unbranded black shirts you usually can buy at any Walmart, and some blue jeans. "Sir, can you help me?" she asked, a slight hint of embarrassment in her voice. "Yeah, sure. What is it?" I responded, placing the can that had been in my hand on the shelf. "There's a guy who keeps asking me to buy hot dogs, though I'm not hungry." I could feel the tone drop down in my voice. "Where at?" I was already walking towards the manager's office before I could even process what was happening. "The back of the store." Her letters were drawn out like she didn't know if I'd take her seriously. I started a brisk, steady pace towards the manager's office. I left the girl there without another word. Once I reached the manager's office, which was not too far from my position, I pushed open the door, dead serious, and said, "Rule 2 in the back of the store." Rose, my manager, quickly got out of her seat and ran out of the room without another word towards the back of the store. I heard a few muffled shouts from the back, but that was about it, and the store was working normally again. After she returned, which was about 30 minutes after, she looked very tired. Her eyes were red and her cheeks were as pale as can be. She was a relatively attractive lady, young, late 20s, nice, lavishing black hair that curled at the end around her shoulders. She also had black curled bangs at the front of her hair, giving her a slender, emo-type look. I tried to ask her about Rule 2 later, but she wouldn't tell me anything other than "it's handled." That was the first and last time I saw the hot dog stand man. Rule number 3. If a customer who wears all red approaches you and tries to start a conversation, don't move or look at their face and agree with everything they have to say. Yeah, no, this isn't a gang member in Los Angeles. This is Ohio, for crying out loud. If it was a gang member, I probably wouldn't be working this crappy retail job. I'm getting off topic. I don't know that much about the mysterious person. I've asked a few other employees, and they all say they haven't seen this person from the rules yet. I only experienced this rule about a month ago. I, by then, had experienced most of the rules. I had just left my manager's office when I saw red high heels and a red skirt approach me. My gaze hadn't went further up than that. My instincts told me that something was very off about this person. It was like the way they held themselves was off. They stopped in front of me, and I didn't move a muscle, and I watched as the red high heels circled around me. "It's a beautiful night, huh?" she said with a voice that sounded like silk. Or at least, I think it's a she. "Yes, ma'am," I said, still looking at the floor. I could only wonder what would happen if the woman crouched down and made me look at her face. I could hear the woman scoff audibly. "Your sister's death was your fault, wasn't it?" Right to the point. I could feel the anger rise quickly in my chest, along with the terrible memories of a murder within our parents' home. I wanted to puke. I wanted to hit someone, something, anything. I looked down at the ground and I swear I could feel a hole forming into the floor. Yes, the bile was choked down with spit as I gulped. I heard a loud chuckle, though it sounded faked and forced. "Good boy," the female said. I watched as the woman in the red high heels walked off and disappeared behind a shelf. I waited for what felt like an hour, but was really 10 minutes before I turned around and walked back into my manager's office. I wanted to quit right then and there, but I decided I didn't want the lady in red to win. She probably wants me to be mad. I quickly told Rose a rundown of what happened, and she nodded quietly, listening to my story. I questioned her and asked her if she could hear me and the lady talking outside. She denied every accusation, although I get the feeling she's lying about not hearing it. At the very end, all she could do was give me a bonus and let me leave early. I mean, that's good enough for me. I think at least. I left work early, and I cried myself to sleep that night. I am sorry if this is abrupt, as I'm recording this on my phone at 7 a.m. If anything else interesting happens, I'll be sure to record it here. Yours truly, JC. My grandpa died when I was just 6. I barely remembered the funeral. I just know that I was sad. He was a good grandpa, the best one you could have. I remember so little, but the warm feelings whenever somebody mentioned him were there. So naturally, I was really sad when he died. But as I was just a kid, I turned to more fun stuff as the years passed. I did not think about my grandpa for a long time, but when I was 16, I found a large suitcase that belonged to him. There were so many things inside, ranging from his old collection of stamps to some letters. I was immediately interested in them, as I saw that most of them were addressed to my grandma. She died long before I was born, when my dad was just a kid. He never told me anything about her, as he didn't remember. But now, I found a whole treasure of letters. There wasn't anything too exciting in them, mostly my grandpa and grandma saying how they loved each other, planning their wedding, and my grandpa's overwhelming joy upon realizing that she was pregnant. The joyful tone of the letters quickly deteriorated as my grandma was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer soon after my dad's birth. She died when he was just 2 years old. The last letter of the bunch was sent to my grandpa's best friend, Mr. Oliver, and in there he was telling him about his sadness and grief upon losing his wife. But it was the last paragraph that caught my attention. "I'm telling you, Ollie, I know that you think that I'm silly, but I know him. Ferdinand took her away, just like he did to my dear Greta." I spent quite a lot of time staring at those words. I had no idea who Greta or Ferdinand were. As far as I knew, there were no two people of such names in my family. I've shown the letters to my parents as well, and they didn't know either. I knew that Mr. Oliver lived in a home for the elderly 2 blocks away, but I didn't know if he was still alive. I wanted to ask him. For some reason, I needed to know. I called the home, and yes, Mr. Oliver was alive. He was rocking his 78th year, so I figured I might pay him a visit. He used to play with me until he had a stroke when I was 10, and from that point on, he wasn't the same. His family put him into the home as they weren't able to take care of him anymore. Mr. Oliver was still able to recognize me. He greeted me as an old friend and offered me some chocolate. We spent some nice time calmly chatting. It was hard to talk to him as he was nearly deaf. Luckily for me, he began remembering his best friend in the middle of our small talk. I told him that I came to ask him something about my grandpa. He immediately raised his eyebrows in anticipation, so I showed him the letter and asked if he could tell me more about Greta and Ferdinand. He spent such a long time looking at the letter, I could see tears form in his eyes as he was remembering his old friend's handwriting. He took a deep breath and told me this story. You know, your grandpa wasn't born here in the USA. He had to flee here from Austria once the Nazis took over. He was born in Graz and lived in Vienna. When he was just 18, he married one beautiful girl named Greta. He told me that she was a tailor and a very sweet soul. They met while he was in college in Vienna. They stayed together for almost a year, but their relationship ended when she was found dead in the Danube. Nobody could explain why. Your grandpa lost his mind then, my dear. He kept talking about Ferdinand. I didn't know who that man was, but your grandfather was absolutely certain that he took the life of his beloved wife. A year later, Nazis began the Anschluss, and he had to flee to America. As his roots were Jewish, he told me all of this when your grandmother died. It completely broke him, but he was willing to live for his son, your father. I believe that he invented Ferdinand in order to cope with his loss. When I left the house for the elderly that evening, I was baffled. I didn't know anything about my grandpa's past, but I wasn't alone. My dad didn't know anything about it either. We were now determined to find out something about my grandpa's life while he was still in Europe. Fast forward 20 years, Dad managed to find my grandpa's old address in Vienna by tracking down his surname. It took him so long, but now that he retired, he had more time on his hands. I had 2 weeks off of my job next month, so I booked a flight to Vienna. My grandpa's old house wasn't a house at all, but a small apartment where he lived during his college years. Now, it was owned by a kind young couple. They were very happy to show me around, but I couldn't find any belongings of my grandpa. The couple told me to ask the landlord and gave me her address. It took a while to find her, as I was in Vienna for the first time in my life, but I was so glad that I did. She was a sweet old lady who was very willing to help me. She told me that she found a case with Greta's things that my grandfather left in the old apartment. Greta truly was beautiful. I believe that she had ginger hair, as her face was freckled, but I couldn't really tell from the black and white photos. My youthful grandpa looked so happy while embracing her in her wedding dress. That was his first wife. I could see her old, now ruined, wedding dress in the same case, and a few newspaper articles carefully cut out and glued together. They were all about her death. Apparently, few witnesses saw her enter the tiny boat at twilight. While she was oaring, she was singing out loud, crying and screaming. She seemed to be in so much pain, and then she just simply jumped into the water. It seemed as if somebody pushed her, but she was alone in the boat. Local people called for help, but when the river police took her out of the water, it was too late. The newspapers interviewed my grandpa, and he said that he didn't understand anything, as they had such a happy and fulfilling marriage. I read all of the articles and couldn't find anything about somebody named Ferdinand. Since I didn't have any other thing to do, I took a train to Graz to try and find my grandpa's childhood home. I spent almost my whole vacation trying to find it, asking the old locals if they remembered him by his surname. One old man told me to try and find him in the city's archives, and that took forever, mostly because I'm not that great at German, but I've managed to find out that my grandpa's birth certificate and everything was moved, but it said which address to which. It seemed as if my grandpa wanted to leave Graz behind and move away to Vienna for his studies, so he took all of his stuff and managed to get citizenship in Vienna. I was so frustrated, but at least I had my grandpa's address. I've managed to find a place where he spent his childhood. It was in ruins. It wasn't exactly in Graz, but in the outskirts. It was an old cottage-like house. I was so creeped out by it, but I wanted to explore. However, I didn't find anything. I just realized that the house wasn't abandoned. It was destroyed by fire. One could clearly tell, as almost every structure was burnt, and most of the weaker materials in the house were turned into cinder. Sadly, without knowing anything more, I had to return back to the USA. Fast forward 2 years, and here I am booking a new trip to Vienna. During those past 2 years, I was searching information like a madman. There are whole lists of people who migrated to the States during World War II, but there wasn't much more info. My grandpa was among them, but the majority of his life during the war and after was hidden. So now, that is why I'm going back to Vienna. I wanted to find something about my grandpa in the city and the college archives. The city archive told me that they'll send me his birth certificate and everything else they could find, but I had to wait, so I went straight to the college. There were some problems with them, obviously, as they wanted to save the privacy even of their deceased students. I was, however, very persistent, so they allowed me to try and dig up some stuff about my gramps. And there was a whole treasure. My grandpa loved to track his day-to-day activities in a planner. He was also writing about his romance with Greta, but the last paragraph he wrote in it was clearly something. Why bother? Why, dear Ferdinand? Why did you kill her? Did you think that you would fool me by making it look like a suicide? I know that it was you. I saw you. I saw you, and you were mocking me. I know you wanted her for yourself. I know you want my life. But the destiny chose me. You took my family away. You left them to be swallowed by flames. And now you do this? And just when I found out that she was pregnant? I am leaving next week and you aren't coming with me. Upon further research, I found that my grandpa didn't have a brother. He had 2 sisters who died during the catastrophic fire that destroyed his family's home. And in his professor's report, there were often remarks about his absent-mindedness, suspicious anxiety, and obsession with ghosts. He clearly had panic attacks during his classes. Was my grandpa undiagnosed schizophrenic? Dad told me that grandpa indeed had all those symptoms even as an adult. He was an overly protective father. He was always urging my dad never to walk anywhere alone, especially at night. He was also obsessed with ghosts. He seemed to see stuff that wasn't there. That was more apparent during stressful times. When my dad told him that he was engaged to my mom, Grandpa did not feel happiness. He could only feel fear. He wasn't sleeping at night for months, even after the marriage. He had an insane habit of sitting in the street with a gun and holding a crucifix the whole night. The neighbors had called the police a couple of times, as he would sometimes spring up. He never fired the gun, but he was aiming at random houses and nobody was feeling safe. But as the years passed, he lost that weird behavior, but he was still extremely cautious. When I was born, Grandpa was thrilled, but also terrified again. He was again keeping watch with a gun and a crucifix, but for this time, it was a little bit shorter. He was much older then, and he would often fall asleep holding a loaded gun on the front yard. My dad had to wake him up by gently kicking him from behind. Almost every time, he would wake up and scream, "Ferdinand!" But he never gave any explanation. He also never wanted to visit psychiatrists. He was afraid that Ferdinand might strike if they incapacitated him with drugs. I was so mad at my dad for not telling me anything about this, but I was even more confused now. And then came my grandfather's birth certificate from Vienna. Now, I know that this may sound insane, that you may think that both me and my whole family are a bunch of lunatics. But hear me out. It turns out that my grandfather was born as a Siamese twin. The other boy attached to him, however, became parasitic during the first year of his life, and they had to be separated. My grandpa survived the surgery, which was a true miracle, but the other boy passed away. But that happened when my grandfather was 6 months old, and his twin was given a name: Ferdinand.